Okay, so today's lesson is going to be on the Sacrament of Holy Orders. And the reason we're stopping here for just one lesson again and talking about this sacrament before we go on with the Mass is because we've reached a point in the Mass where we are about to offer the sacrifice. The whole Mass together is the Mass, but this is the part of the Mass that makes it the Mass. Otherwise, it's just a prayer service, right? So this is where the sacrifice is going to happen. And the sacrifice is offered by priests. And this is important because I know we hear all the time, especially living in a Protestant culture, like I'm asked all the time, are you a preacher? I said, no. I mean, I preach, but I'm not a preacher. Preaching is part of what I do, but it's not the most important thing I do. I'm not just a pastor either. I'm not just leading, although that's also a very important thing about what I do, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I am principally a priest, which means I offer sacrifice. And that's why we call our priests Father, but we refer to them as priests. This can sometimes be confusing in Spanish because in Spanish we rarely use priest, we rarely use sacerdote, we use Father, Padre for everything. But you want to make sure that we understand that we call the priest Father, but he is a priest, which means he offers sacrifice. And the sacrament that we receive in order to do this is called the Sacrament of Holy Orders. So we're just going to talk for a minute about what this sacrament means that we've received. So the first thing is what the sacrament is in and of itself. Well, the bishop lays hands on the priest, which is an ancient symbol in the scriptures, and particularly we see it in the New Testament with the ordination that the apostles do, of conferring this authority, of giving this authority, this power, this role to the men who are ordained. And the bishop will pray a long prayer, the most important line being, the one that makes you a priest is, "Grant, we pray, Almighty Father, to this your servant, the dignity of the priesthood." Now, we all know that the sacraments are outward signs instituted by Christ to give grace. And that means that they were founded, they were made and given to us by Christ. And so the Eucharist, as we know, is instituted at the Last Supper. And since the Eucharist is a sacrifice, remember the Mass is the unbloody sacrifice of the cross, then if there's a sacrifice, there is a priest that offers that sacrifice. And so when Jesus instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper, he also ordained the apostles. And the word he uses in St. John's Gospel is to consecrate them. That's the word that he uses because that's the same word that was used in the Old Testament when Moses had the priests ordained as well. Being a priest, receiving the sacrament, I should say, of holy orders, gives the priest the power to forgive sins and to consecrate the Eucharist. And he is ordained by the bishop. The bishop is the minister of the sacrament of the holy orders that ordains him. And the people that can receive the sacrament are baptized men. Now, in our world, that seems unfair, but that's because we don't really accept what God teaches us about the difference between men and women. And we're living in all kinds of confusion about that. But God made men and women different, and he gave them different roles. Jesus only chose men as his apostles, not because Jesus didn't like women. In fact, most of the more faithful people that followed Jesus were women, but he gave them this role because that was part of his plan. Why? Well, Jesus is a man. Jesus is a male because Jesus is the bridegroom. He's the husband of the church. And because there's a difference between men and women, and because priests take the part of Jesus, we have to be the husbands, the bridegroom of the church, which means we can't be women because then we'd be the bride. So we take the place of Christ, who is himself a male, because we are the bridegroom, the husband of the church. And the other part of this is the way God established things is that in the family, the man is supposed to be the leader of the family. Now, it doesn't always work, and that's a subject for another video, but even though that doesn't always work that way, men are supposed to be in charge of the family. They're supposed to be gentle, they're supposed to be kind, they're not supposed to be bossy, but they're supposed to be in charge. Well, if the priest is the head of the family of the church, then the priest should also be a man to fulfill that role. And then the last thing I want to say about the Sacrament of Holy Orders is how often it's received. Now, you know, with some of the sacraments, you receive them only once, and some of the sacraments you receive over and over, like confession and Holy Eucharist. Holy Orders is received once as a deacon and once as a priest. You don't get to repeat them. You don't need to get them again, because once you're ordained a deacon or a priest, that is permanent, and I will be a priest for eternity. Now, if we want the Eucharist, we need priests, because that's what Jesus established. So if we need priests, then we need young men to consider the priesthood. And just speaking about vocations in general, what God is calling you to. God calls some men to be priests. He calls some men and some women to follow him in a very special way as consecrated religious, that is, monks or nuns, brothers or sisters, who live their life for God in a very special way. They're not priests, but they have a special role. And some of us are called to this special role. You may be called to this special role. The question you have to ask yourself is not ask yourself, sorry. What the question you need to ask God is, what do you want me to do? Look at the example of the saints. Look at the example of men and women in your lives, if you know any that are priests or nuns or brothers who have consecrated themselves, and ask God if that's what you're being called to. Not everyone is called to that. Just because you want to be a good follower of Jesus does not mean that you have to be a priest or a nun or a brother or anything. But you should consider it. You need to consider the option because of how important that role is in the church. And pray about it and ask for God's guidance to see if that's what he's calling you to do.